Haunted house. This story was about my grandpa and his childhood friends. I had heard from him in a tea break with him a few days ago. This all began from my grandpa's childhood day when he was just a little boy, around 8 years old. Back then, even though there were many kids in the neighborhood, my grandpa was the youngest one, so kids always teased him up and didn't bring him along with them when they were hanging out there. My grandpa had to call them aloud and insisted on taking him with them very often. My grandpa really persisted. He often followed the two sons of his neighbor around even they didn't want to, and how bad they teased him. They told him to stop following them and better get back home or else my grandpa's mother would scold him. One day, the two sons of his neighbor discussed that they want to discover the haunted house of the village. While they were discussing, my grandpa got there and asked them to take him as well. At first, they had told him that he was still a kid, they didn't want to babysit him, but after a while, hearing my grandpa wanted to join badly, they let him in. The house they wanted to discover was well known for being haunted by ghosts in the town. Parents had prohibited their kids to not come any close to the house. People said that the owner had too scared of the house and left it there abandoning. The house looked very quiet and deserted. People said that evil spirits were living in the house. The house used to be spacious and clean. The landlord had intended to sell out it. But the rumor had spread around. People talked to one and another, then the landlord had to leave the house and abandon it. Ever since the day the landlord had left the house and moved out, there was no one dare to step into the house. My grandpa had been very excited once hearing the plan of the neighbors, so he had insisted them to let him in. But right after stepping to the gate of the house, my grandpa got a bit scared. He told his neighbors that if it was too risky to them, their parents had told them that they had not allowed going to the house. At that moment, the two brothers had stepped inside already, but my grandpa got reluctant. He was rethinking and wanted to stop his neighbors. His neighbors turned to my grandpa and ridiculed him. They thought he was a coward. They said they didn't want him to come with them from the start. If he got scared, just be their guest and back home. They were still going to discover the house. The more my grandpa wanted to stop them, the more they wanted to explore the haunting house. Kids are always curious. After laughing at my grandpa, they pushed the gate covered with spider's web and dirt and stepped inside. After the dirty gate, the yard was overgrown by many weeds. The weed was even higher than a half of the wall. It was surrounded by a dark, gloomy atmosphere. Probably that was because there was no one living in the house in a long time, or there was another reason. The two brothers had stepped around and carefully looked around. While my grandpa stood there, he didn't want to come inside. My grandpa stood outside, deduced a while. Even he sensed something wrong with the house and got scared, but anyhow, he was just a curious kid. Later on, he grinned his teeth and stepped into the house to continue hanging out with his neighbors, even though deep down, he didn't want to. Once my grandpa ran after them, he saw they were looking around the front yard. In the front yard, there was nothing weird except the weeds and old garbages. So they decided to step further into the house. Right after stepping inside the house, my grandpa smelt something weird, unpleasant that made him unable to breathe. He smelt the fungi, the old and mixed up with the rotten, that was unexplainable smelt. The furniture in the house was likely to be moved already with the landlord. There were just some sundries messing on the ground in the dirty, abandoned house. One of my grandpa's neighbors spoke up. He was talking to my grandpa that my grandpa should take a look around. There was no ghost as the rumor, just dust, and more dust. That was such an untrusted rumor to scare kids like my grandpa. Out of the blue, the other one screamed aloud in panic as if he had seen a horrible thing. They ran towards that boy. My grandpa asked him what happened to him and why he was scared. The boy pointed out towards the opposite direction and told them that he saw a creepy head over there. They looked in that direction, and indeed, there was something similar to a human head. That thing's color was similar to Bacon's. The face was withered, its skin was wrinkled like a flat balloon, and only hair looked new. After carefully checking out, the kids could calm down. That was just a head model, not a human head. They thought that was intended to hang there by the owner to protect the house from robberies or evil spirits. They tried to search around the house for a while afterward. Then, one of the neighbors said that he brought there a match. He could light the match up and burn that thing out. The one who wanted to burn the head model out was the one had been scared of earlier. He was likely to release his anger afterward. My grandpa tried to stop them, but they persisted, ignored him out because they thought my grandpa was such a coward. The boy fired the match and tossed it towards the head. Shortly, the head had been burnt out. The burning smell rose up to their noses. Suddenly, when the head was burning, the two of my grandpa's neighbors got scared off. They pushed one another to run out of the house shortly. They said that there was nothing left to see, they better got out there. My grandpa ran after them closely. But after a few steps, my grandpa heard something. He recalled a crying sound and a moaning sound from the burning head's direction. He was too curious. He stopped by, turned his head back, and stared inside the house. He told me that once he stared inside the house, towards the head, it was like the head had angrily stared back at them as well in the middle of the fire. Right after moving out of the house, those kids split up and kept everything in secret. Even though the scary look of the head still stuck on my grandpa's head, he was more scared that his parents would scold him, so he didn't have a gut to tell the family about that. That night, after dinner, he went to bed very early. He had a very good sleep without a dream. Nothing had happened that night. In the morning, after being awakened, he opened his eyes and saw a bunch of hair on his pillow. My grandpa Jolt awoke and screamed aloud, "Oh my God." Then, he touched his head with his hands. He felt that he had no hair. The hair on the pillow was him. All of his hair had fallen off. My grandpa had screamed out very loud. Hearing he was in a panic, his parents ran to his bedroom to check what happened with him. Right being there, they were all shocked from what they could see. They asked him what happened to him. My grandpa told me that, at that moment, he could see the shock in his parents' faces. They faltered to ask him what happened with my hair with their shaken voice. My grandpa trembled in tears. He had no idea. He woke up as usual, and his hair fell all off. His parents sensed there must have been something wrong. After a while, they tried to calm down and asked him what he had done wrong. My grandpa didn't want to hide anymore. He told them about his adventure to the haunted house, but he tried to skip the worst part. He told them and choked tearfully. After hearing my grandpa, his parents took him to the neighbor's house. The two brothers were in the same situation as my grandpa. They were all ball overnight. The two families had a talk with each other and supposed there was something wrong. So they discussed and ended up bringing their kids to Uncle Jen's place. Uncle Jen was the most reputable man in the village. Hopefully, he could help them sort everything out. Their parents took the three kids to Jen's place, and told him the whole thing, and begged him, please help their kids getting out of their current situation. Only he had experienced a lot and been very well known for his wise in the village. Hearing the whole thing, Uncle Jen turned to those kids and seriously asked them if they had hidden anything else. He could only help if they tell him the whole truth. He didn't believe they had told him the entire thing when they were at the haunted house back then. Uncle Jen supposed those kids must have been shaved by something. Hearing that Uncle Jen was unable to help if they didn't tell him what happened at the haunted house, my grandpa was scared to death and told them the burn hair part. He spitted out that the siblings had burnt the head. Uncle Jen was very irritated then, but seeing those poor kids crying, he got a bit softened. He told the parents to take them to the haunted house with him. People around the town heard of that and also walked after us hurriedly. Everyone had gathered in front of the haunted house's gate, which had been abandoned in years. Uncle Jen walked ahead of us. He pushed the door and stepped inside. A few people came after him. Passing by the front yard, which was covered by weeds, they stepped into the house. Uncle Jen started to give a look. People walked by him. They could see the seriousness in Jen's face and asked if ghosts were really existing in the world, if the ghost had made the kids bawl. Even though they said to children on their own about that haunted house, but that was the first time they had eyewitnessed that kind of event. Another one asked Uncle Jen if the kids mentioned earlier were the head over there, which was covered by black hair. Jen looked at the head, burned, and shouted out a weird and difficult to pronounce. He said that was Zygu. Hearing the weird word, people started the discussion and wondered what was that. What was Zygu? That was the first time they had heard of that thing. One of them curiously asked Uncle Jen out, "What is Zygu? How was it related to shaving the head of the 3 kids?" Even though no one had a clue about Zygu, but they had all believed that the kids had pissed the evil spirit of the house off. Uncle Jen started to explain about the burnt head model in the middle of the house. Zygu was a thing that was guarding the house. The rumor about the haunted house had started when there was someone had walked by the house and saw Zygu and thought that was a hanging woman. The fact that some wizard had used a death's head and cast a spell to it then turned it to a protector of the house. If someone burned or destroyed it without a dispel, they would bring a disaster. Those kids had put up with heresy by chance. Uncle Jen continued that Zygu didn't stop at shaving their head. Later on, they would take another action and harm the kids. Their parents got scared from what they were hearing. They repeatedly begged Uncle Jen to help them and get away from the evil's revenge. Uncle Jen drowned to his thought a while and told people to go out. He wanted to talk to Zygu in person. He closed the door and was in the house alone with that creepy thing. People didn't want to get on his way. They left the room and closed the door out. Some of them were still curious, but they had no gut to eavesdrop outside. And so, people stepped out of the house. No one had an idea what Uncle Jen would talk to that demonic Zygu. There was a brave man. He came to the windows and quietly listened to what happened inside. The mother of my grandpa's neighbors asked if he could hear what Uncle Jen talked about or done something inside. The man reported to her what he had heard and seen. He didn't hear it clearly, but he saw Uncle Jen stood there and talked by himself for a long while. It looked like he was negotiating with Zygu. People buzzed around about what happened inside, and out of the blue, Uncle Jen stepped out. He requested people to keep silent first. One of them came to Uncle Jen and asked how the situation was and how to help those little kids. Uncle Jen got serious. He said that he had found out the way and asked some of the strong men to follow him to the dried well at the backyard. Then they were about to dig out a dead body. People didn't want to take time. They found shovels and followed Uncle Jen to the well in the backyard. When people reached the backyard, indeed, they saw a dried well there. Out of the blue, they all felt cold and trembled there. People started to drop the rope and climb down the dried well. Inside, there was really no water, just weed and garbages around. The deeper they came down, the colder they got. After the dedicated ones got there, they started to dig out the ground as Jen requested. After more than a half-meter digging out, they touched something, they seemed. One of them called Uncle Jen to notify him of what they had found. Uncle Jen stared down and asked them to move it carefully up there. At that moment, Uncle Jen was likely to give a light sigh. They dug out a big jar, tied it tightly to the rope, and told people up there, outside of the well, to pull it out carefully. Once the big jar had been brought up, people gathered around to see it, and the closest to the jar was Uncle Jen. The jar looked new. No one could tell how long it had been buried under the dried well. There was a wooden lid covering it tightly at the mouth of the jar. There was a bloody red line on top of the lid, which was likely an incarnation. Uncle Jen asked a man next to him to open the lid out. People there all hold their breaths to wait for what was going to happen next, what was inside the jar. The one who had been asked was my grandpa's father. He was my great-grandpa. He slowly opened the jar out. Once the lid had been lifted up, there was a rotten cum to people's noses that made them all nauseous. They had to spit out that where the hell that horrible smell came from. Inside the jar, there was something like mud inside, and in the middle of that muddy liquid, there was a corpse that had been cut off the head. Uncle Jen asked people to find a coffin, then tried to bring that dead body out of the jar, put the dead body to the coffin, and with the head in the middle of the house, which had been burnt by my grandpa and his neighbors but still remained as it was. Then dug out a hole and buried the coffin formally. People didn't know how Uncle Jen could talk to the head and found the body, but they started to admire him. Not long after the dead body had been buried, my grandpa and his childhood friends regained their hair. Their hair grew back. Probably, after being through that creepy event together, my grandpa and his neighbors became closer and spent more time hanging out together. And then, there was another rumor spread out. People said that the haunted house had belonged to a wizard. He had cultivated the black magic, so he used the head of a dead body to hang in the middle of the house, but eventually, he got counterproductive. He nearly lost his life, so he wanted to sell the house out and moved to another place already. Unfortunately, people had seen the head and rumored his house had been haunted, so he had to left the house instantly and run away.